This is the GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 204 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Basil Camus, co-owner of Leaf and Limb Tree Service, about natural tree care. The plant profile is on Angel's Trumpet, Brugmansia, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events and this week's garden tasks in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on hollyhock memories from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Basil Camus. He is the co-owner of Leaf and Limb, a tree care company in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome, Basil.
Thanks so much for having me, Kathy. It's an honor to be here.
Great to have you on, and we're going to talk about all things tree care and tree stewardship, and maybe go into some other pockets of plant nerddom along the way. But before we go into all of that, Basil, we'd like to ask our guests here on the GardenDC podcast, were they born with a green thumb and chlorophyll in their veins?
I'm excited about this question because I know you ask your guests this, and I've been thinking about that. I don't think I was born with a green thumb. I did enjoy playing outside as a kid, and I have fond memories of running around in the little patch of woods near our apartment area and the neighborhood we lived in. I don't think I really developed a fondness for trees until much later in life. And I know we're going to probably get into that, but I'd really actually say that my green thumb probably really took shape at about the age of 30.
How? So we can call that, pun intended, a late bloomer.
There you go.
So what did you pursue as a profession before you got into plants and trees?
I graduated from Duke with a degree in economics, and my first job, I was an economic analyst for a risk arbitrage division for a law firm in Washington, D.C., lived in Arlington for a number of years, really loved it, just living there. The work itself was not exactly what I wanted to do. I realized pretty early on. So I shifted dramatically and decided to pursue my interests in Africa. I had studied abroad in Cape Town, loved it there, had dreamed of starting a travel company. So actually, me and my dad started a travel company where we would build these trips, and I would take people over and he would take people over. And that was really amazing. I learned a lot about how to run and operate a professional company. Sort of at the same time, my dad had his business going on, which was a Leaf and Limb Tree Service. It was a traditional tree service that he started back in the late 90s, and it was just exactly what you'd expect from a tree service. We cut trees down, we trimmed trees, didn't even really know what pruning was. It was just, it was a way for him to support the family. It wasn't until later our travel company was doing well, but I was at a junction in my life where I was going to potentially have to move to Africa full time, and I wasn't quite ready for that. And instead we decided to sell that company. And I joined him we became business partners at Leaf and Limb Tree Service. And that sort of was the starting off point for where I went next in my career. That happened in my young to mid 20s. And I've been here at this company for 15 years.
Wow. So you had probably to get an arborist certification to join that company. Where did you pursue that?
No. Most of the tree service industry are not certified arborists. This is, here in Raleigh, we probably have 400 tree services. I would sort of broadly classify them as you've got the two huge, dominant, professional, 100-year plus companies, Bartlett and Davie. Mm-hmm. Then you've got a series of mid-sized companies that are local footprint. I don't think we have any statewide footprint, but, sizable operations, 15, 20 employees. And then you have a plethora of small tree services. This is where my dad sort of was with Leaf and Limb Tree Service early on. And it's an owner, it's a single truck, it's maybe one full-time employee and maybe one or two seasonal employees. And that was sort of where my dad fit in. Unfortunately, most of the tree service that I've just described, credentials aren't really a part of the strategy. It's really just cutting trees down. You want to branch off your house? Sure, we'll cut it off. I mean, back in the beginning, we didn't know anything about anything. And early on, sort of my goal was, okay, let's build a successful company. Let's scale. Let's become profitable. Let's become a big player in North Carolina, maybe even beyond. And one of the original strategies I set off on is, if we're going to do that, then we've got to find ways to differentiate ourselves. We've got to get into some of these more challenging classes of services like pest management and disease control, these things that really is sort of the Bartlett-Davy territory. That really began, that was a pivotal part of my journey, because as I got into that journey, I inadvertently began with soil. Jeff Lowenfels, Paul Stamets, some of these other regenerative agriculture, these were my entry points into soil. And that took me on this learning journey where I came to understand that trees were just soil ecosystems, the trees, the ecosystems they participate in, incredible, complicated, just so fascinating to me. And it was through that journey that I earned the credentials, became a tree expert, and then ultimately sort of those sowed the seeds for my later transformation into where I am now.
Great. And I love that, sow the seeds, so to speak. So before we get into all that and great tree care and how you morph the company, let's talk a little bit about what you grow for pleasure. And what are you growing in your own home garden?
Well, I have converted my yard to all native meadows, pocket forests, and thickets. I only now, for the few little bits and bobs of plants that are important to me, I do all of that in large containers. But if you were to visit my yard, you would find, all in with these 3 different ecosystems, probably 150 different native species in my yard. And I think probably the one I'm enjoying the most right now is one called Chickasaw plum. It's one of our native plums here in North Carolina, and I've got one well positioned where I can just pick plums off as I walk into my house, and they are delicious.
I was just at the Delaware beaches and looking at their beach plums, the natives there, and I was wondering how closely related those might be to the Chickasaw plum.
I think a lot of our native plums. I'm only now learning a lot more about how indigenous people cultivated these plums as food sources. So I suspect there's a lot of, they're very close, I'm sure. But I think the Chickasaw plum is probably a little bit on the smaller side compared to those. Still equally sweet and delicious.
Yeah, and they make a great jam. So let's talk about a couple of things that you said were in your home landscape, and starting with that thickets, and maybe defining what a thicket is for you in a home landscape.
Yeah, I would. So we often at Leaf and Limb get requests for privacy rows, and typically the way privacy rows work is it's going to be a single type of plant, and they're planted in a row. The classics around here, and I'm sure it's the same for most of the Mid-Atlantic, it's American holly, or it's a Carissa holly, various holly species, or it could be the green giant arborvitae, or God forbid, the Leland cypress, which is the usual suspects. And the challenge there is, not only are those nursery trees often expensive, you've got to help water them for a number of years to get them established. Then you have this single species type that's vulnerable to disease. We've seen this with the Leland cypresses. Our approach is, let's take that same area and let's load it with native saplings. And I'm defining a sapling as being a young tree that's maybe 1 to 2 years old. The beauty of these is that you can plant 25 of these saplings at the time it takes to plant one traditional 15-gallon green giant, let's say. So for the same budget, the same amount of time, you can load that area up with native shrubs that only max out at, say, 12 feet. You have rich diversity in the face of new diseases and pressures from droughts and things like that. And you also have this really incredible habitat for all sorts of birds and insects. And you get the utilitarian function you're looking for, which is the screening. And then my personal favorite is the maintenance requirements are a lot less. You do not need to replenish mulch. You don't have the watering requirements. When you're working with these native saplings, they're often much more hardy with lower water requirements. First several years, you do have to make sure no invasive plants move in, but so long as you keep those out, after say 2 or 3 growing seasons, this ecosystem establishes, and it becomes very hard for other plants to penetrate this ecosystem. So it's just a low maintenance situation with a lot of great ecological value. And I mentioned that Chickasaw plum. I intentionally planted those and some of our native blueberries on the periphery of my thicket just because I like fruit. I don't have a neighbor on that side, but if I did, we would share the fruit.
And so you mentioned it being a lot easier to plant all those saplings. Can you describe that planting process?
Yeah, essentially what we do is, let's say we were working with some diseased Leland cypresses, which is actually a site I was on yesterday. So they're beyond repair. The client would be, or the homeowner, we would need to remove the Leland cypresses. The stumps can stay put, no problem. We would cover the area with cardboard and then with, say, 6 inches of wood chips at a minimum, maybe even more. And we would do that right about now in the middle of the growing season so we can kill off some of that vegetation. That would get nice and mushy and rot over the next 6 months so that when we get into January, we can come back and we bring our saplings with us. We would want, for us, we like to have at least 25 native species. We grow our own, which we can talk about, but you can also buy these from nurseries that sell these sorts of plants. And we plant them approximately 2 to 3 feet apart. So we come in, you drive the shovel in the ground, you wedge it open, you slide one of these saplings in place, and then you move 2 or 3 foot offset with a different species. You don't want to plant it. It should be haphazard because that's how nature works. The goal is simply fill the area with these native saplings approximately 2 to 3 feet apart. That's it for the planting. And like I said, I'm pretty good at it. I can do 30 plus per hour. Somebody who's new to this work, 20 to 25. It takes about that long to properly plant a 15-gallon tree if you understand, the need to excavate the root collar and all that good stuff. So that's the planting process. The maintenance requirements after that, we recommend 0 watering just because we want these saplings to have to struggle. That's part of being a long-lived species in the urban environment. The only thing we do is we will go in there, and if there are, for example, English ivy or Bradford pear or mimosa, some of these species that could be very aggressive, for the first 2 growing seasons, we need to keep those out. And even, say, a maple samara, a seed that might float in and turn into a young maple in that thicket, we'd actually pluck that as well because we don't want those trees. This is meant to only be a 12-foot height, let's say, or an 8-foot, whatever you want. You can plan accordingly. And then after 2 growing seasons, we have found that the canopy is closed and really almost no maintenance requirements necessary.
This is sounding really familiar, Basil, as in the very similar process for what I recommend for establishing ground covers as well, whether native or not. So it's always the first couple years are the more maintenance, getting out anything else that might be wanting to seed in or weeds. And then after that, you're good.
Yes, your book is amazing. I love that approach because it's essentially tapping into natural ecosystems. We're letting one system outcompete another system, which is great for us because it's less work, less money, that sort of thing.
And when you're describing the planting of the saplings, you're obviously advocating for kind of a more natural pattern, not just little rows of soldiers.
Agreed. The key here is, let's say I'm going to put 5 different Chickasaw plums in this area. Yes, I sort of spread them out, but I don't do a plan. We want diversity and randomness. It just gives it some resilience.
I think it's also more pleasing in the end to the human eye. I mean, we like symmetry and pattern and formalness, but we also like, those rhythms, I will call them, and a little bit of surprise.
Yes, there's new opportunities that we can't envision that will. Yeah, I love surprises.
Similar to when we're planting our spring blooming bulbs in the fall, you can either do it in those nice neat rows, or you can just dig a large hole and just throw the bulbs in, and then where they land is where they're going to grow.
Right. And my sell here is that it's roughly the same price, long term or effort. Long term, you're going to have reduced maintenance. But then there's these environmental aspects where this system is going to be better at capturing carbon and holding rainwater and supporting birds and butterflies. There's all these really wonderful environmental positive benefits as well.
Hmm. And can I ask you on the side, you mentioned doing a layer of cardboard. Do you have any concerns about that cardboard sourcing or material? Do you use any special cardboard, or are you reusing recycled cardboard?
Yeah, generally we're trying to make use of waste streams.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes for big projects, we might actually have to buy rolls, but typically we like to use our Amazon boxes and things like that. It's pretty wild how fast that cardboard disappears. The soil organisms digest it quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been doing a little bit of reading and research about cardboard materials, and I think most of it seems like it's okay unless it's been sprayed with like a plastic film,
Yeah.
or the white. It seems like if
Yes.
it has the white, which most Amazon boxes, as we're going to call out Amazon in particular, not normally in a white box, but the white introduces bleach into the system.
Yes, agreed. And I know there's this emerging conversation around toxins in cardboard. Personally think that's getting a little too nuanced and sort of losing sight of the forest for the trees, because it's way better than using a glyphosate herbicide, and it's not practical to sit there and try and dig out. So we have to balance these things, and I think cardboard is a nice balance.
Mm-hmm. And it is basically tree.
At its core, yeah.
So basically it came from a tree, going back to the tree. If you know that obviously it had chemicals in it or something, then maybe some cautions. Again,
Right.
avoid the white covered ones. And then I also wanted to ask you kind of alluded to it, the sources of those native saplings, especially shrubs and trees. That can be a little tough, especially for the home gardener.
It can. And to that end, do you want me to offer some thoughts on that?
Sure.
I would. So, okay, we have a nonprofit here that we started called Project Pando, and we actually go out and collect seeds from native trees in this area, and we grow them ourselves in this very easy approach. They're called air pruning boxes. It's just a frame with a wire mesh on the bottom, and you can put in leaf compost or rotting leaves that you can probably get for free from the city's leaf collection services. And you plant seeds, and they grow up into these little saplings that have amazing root systems. This is something, I have a book that I'm giving away for free, and I actually give a how-to on how people can do this. It can be done on an individual basis or as a community or even as a nonprofit like we do. That, to me, is a great way to do it, but I also recognize that there are sort of barriers to entry there. I would recommend for those, if you don't have access to good saplings in your area, maybe you don't have a native nursery that does that, there are some online resources like Itzel that's sort of beginning to offer this. We have a place here in North Carolina called Mellow Marsh. I know they ship. So I think online there are opportunities to buy these saplings. It may not be perfectly native, like hyper native, but it could still be from, say, an adjacent state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think more and more, especially in the Washington, D.C. area, there's native tree and shrub giveaways usually around Arbor Day, and even some free tree programs out there.
Yeah, it's a thing. I think there's more attention to this. I think we're going to see a rise in availability. But again, I want to say growing your own trees is shockingly easy to do, because it turns out that trees do actually come from other trees. They grow on trees, unlike money. And an air pruning box is just, it's a very simple system that produces a really wonderful outcome. It's a young sapling with a very well-developed root system. And again, it's just does not require much effort.
And I think from my own experience, and I'm going to guess from yours too, Basil, starting either from seed or from sapling, you get a much better tree or shrub in the end than you do from a gallon potted plant.
Absolutely. I could spend an hour talking about why containerized and balled and burlap trees are just The short of it is forgetting the carbon footprint with growing them, and forgetting the practices and the infections that come out of nurseries. Just at its bottom line, there's no handicap on the root system. Containerized trees and balled and burlap trees have handicapped root systems that they'll spend their whole life trying to overcome, and they may or may not be able to overcome it.
That's a great way to describe it. And I realized when you were talking about your seed collecting and local project that listeners, it's Pando,
Correct.
not Panda,
Yep.
not like the zoo. And where does Pando, the name, come from?
It's the quaking aspen colony in Utah. It's this amazing forest of quaking aspens. And if you were to walk through it, you'd think you were in a forest, and you are. But turns out these trees are all the same organism. So Pando is built on this idea that we're all rooted in shared resources. What's good for one is good for all. And that by being stewards of our shared resources, we can create a brighter future.
Excellent. Let's talk a bit about your book. And so the title is From Wasteland to Wonder, and subtitle Easy Ways We Can Help Heal Earth in the Sub/Urban Landscape. So suburban or urban landscape. So it's particularly aimed at the homeowner in those areas or home gardener. And I found it a really easy book, very accessible for anybody diving in, maybe somebody who just purchased their first house. This, I think, would be an excellent book to give them if they're just wondering, now what do I do? I think you supply a lot of great answers in that. And I was wondering, why the title, From Wasteland to Wonder? Do you consider suburban landscapes a wasteland?
You know, it's interesting. I think sometimes I live in multiple worlds. I live in the gardener world because I am a gardener, and I live in, like the Audubon Society world of folks who love birds. But I also, as a business owner, I am out every day meeting with people and helping them with their tree care needs or their various landscaping needs. And I spend a lot of time out in what I'll call suburbia. And the truth of it is, I think we gardeners sometimes maybe get lost in our own bubbles because the majority of people live in these spaces that are fairly barren. They've been graded and they built the houses, and then they rolled out some sod of Bermuda grass. They stuck some non-native cheap plants in the ground. You're going to find a lot of Laura petalum and, man, just a cast of the usual characters, Nandina, you name it, the usual suspects. And when you walk in these neighborhoods, there is not a whole lot of life. And then you've got the landscaper pumping the area full of fertilizers, and you go to the creeks nearby and they're clogged up with algae from the runoff. You don't find birds there. And these places, especially right now, are just blazing hot. Wasteland is, I think, an adequate description for a lot of the suburban space, at least from what I've experienced in this area.
Mm-hmm. Especially the newer landscapes.
Right.
Once you've gotten some larger trees to fill in, and a little bit more ecosystem established in an older suburb might be a little bit better.
Agreed. Yeah. And those tend to be more affluent, longer established. All the most expensive neighborhoods in Raleigh and Durham do have old canopies. But that's not where the majority. I think we have about 1 million people in Wake County. Very small percentage of those people are living in those spaces or are even gardeners. The average person that we meet with at Leaf and Limb is sort of as you described, maybe a new homeowner, maybe not. They don't have time to research and become a top-level gardener, and they don't have the money to afford a designer who can give them something. They're kind of stuck in this situation where the only thing they can afford to do is just hire a standard landscaping company or a standard tree care company who just perpetuates the status quo. Bermuda grass, fertilizers, cut the trees down, plant non-natives. Just, and I understand it's affordable and it's the way things work. And this book is meant to give them a way out. This is another way to do things where you can actually save time and money versus the status quo. It's hard to ask the majority of homeowners to become a gardener. They don't have time. But if we can give them a way that they could do things differently in their yard that actually ends up saving them time and money in the long run, now we've got a compelling argument. And the beautiful thing is these practices also happen to be the ones that could help heal Earth in the suburban landscape. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that suburbia does not make up much land mass. It's maybe like 2% of the US, but these are where people live. So I think if more people are doing these things and understand these concepts, now this translates into how we spend dollars and how we vote on bills and bonds. It could have bigger implications for wider land use.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, starting with local governments and HOAs, a lot of these landscapes are mandated.
Right,
so
unfortunately.
We're finding it with the ground covers, of course, being mandated that it must be a turf grass lawn of some kind in the front, or that you can't plant a tree that would shade your neighbor.
Yeah.
I kind of sympathize with, because I want to grow vegetables and herbs too. But yeah,
Right.
I also want old growth trees. So there's, a lot of layers to it.
I think here locally, we're seeing municipalities making positive changes. I know DC and Arlington are more progressive than Raleigh and Durham. We're still seeing some change at a municipal level here, which is really exciting. The HOAs, I do think, will be probably the last bastion of change. They're very hard to get bylaws changed. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. Or similarly, a law was just passed in Maryland that bypasses the HOA as far as native landscapes go. So we're saying that HOAs can't put rules around that, is basically what the legislation says. But, that's going to be a hard sell in a lot of areas.
It'll be interesting. Yeah, I followed that, and it's so exciting. North Carolina sort of falls in this unique set of states. It's like North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas. There's a few others that are very HOA forward to the point where it even ties into local and state government laws. We have sort of some unusual things here. But I will say, glimmer of hope. Yay, Maryland. Let's see if we can do it in other states.
Yeah, and HOAs are so funny because it is quasi-governmental, but it's not elected usually.
Right.
I didn't elect my neighbor's HOA organization, but they might have elected their board.
It's the most thankless job in the world, being on an HOA board. We work with them, and my heart goes out to everybody who's trying to help manage their communities.
Mm-hmm. Same thing in condo associations, retirement communities.
Right.
Those volunteer leaders are getting it from all sides. So
oh, yeah.
My sympathies to them. So let's talk a little bit more about your book. And what I noticed is there are very short bites, easy to digest, but then you have QR codes for more.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to give people an easy entry in with options to go deeper. And I also wanted to give written instructions as well as video tutorials, because that can be helpful just to see how things are done. We at Leaf and Limb do we're a business local to this area. We have a lot of local readership with our newsletter. And every month for many years now, we've been writing articles and producing videos. So we've gotten to see firsthand sort of what's engaging and what's not. And we have just found that if you can keep things fairly simple, fairly manageable, fairly doable, and include some videos, it makes it much easier to at least dip a toe in the water. So that was the goal. Give people an easy way to dip a toe in the water. And if you want to go deeper.
And one of the little blurbs I was reading said, don't even bother doing a soil test at the beginning. And that kind of flies in the face of, every master gardener or talk I've ever been to that says, always start with a soil test. So let's talk about soil tests.
Yeah. That is, of course, a controversial statement. There's a couple in my book that might fly in the face of traditional knowledge. But the truth of the matter is, and this is particularly true for the Mid-Atlantic. I can't speak for all the Mid-Atlantic. Let me just narrow it down. For North Carolina and where we are, we have a lot of red clay, and it is rich in nutrients. The issue is not a lack of nutrients for trees or shrubs. The issue is that there's no life in the soil to unlock those nutrients. I like to refer to dirt, it's sand, silt, and clay, and then soil is dirt plus life. And life is really where the magic happens. So if you have life in the soil, it's unlocking those nutrients for your plants. It's also that life is tunneling and burrowing and hunting, and it's creating structure. It's also eating and pooping and excreting, which is making microaggregates and macroaggregates, again, more structure. These things allow more water, which then helps more life. So the limiting factor in suburbia is life in the soil, not nutrients. Therefore, the whole basis for soil tests, at least traditional soil tests, really is meaningless. The better test, if you're going to get a test, is what is the amount of living biology, microbiology, or life? What is the living? I would get a microbiology test. That's at least more useful. But even that, unless you're a professional farmer, this is not universally true, but I'm just speaking to people in suburbia. You need to start with the basics, which is get massive amounts of life in your soil. Now, if you get to such an elite level, like where you're a regenerative farmer managing thousands of acres, and you do need to, there is a higher tier here, but this is not normal for the suburban space.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, I would recommend soil tests for heavy metals if you're growing edibles, especially root vegetables. But other than that, you're correct. We really are not mostly in this area or most of the mid-Atlantic dealing with nutrient poor soils.
Yeah, and you're right about the edibles. Things can get a little different, especially with the heavy metals. I 100% agree with you. If you know you're on a brown site, I don't think I'm using the right phrase there, but if there's been previous industrial activity, you should definitely get a heavy metals test before you grow, say, carrots or something.
So if I was to do the micro life test and found that my soil was deficient, what are some of the things you would advocate to return some of that life to the soil?
Strategies are very simple. We've got some really good heavyweights. One of my favorites is arborist wood chips. And these are the wood chips that happen when a tree service puts branches or logs through a chipper and it goes in the back of a truck. They often will give them away for free. And that is really amazing stuff. My second heavyweight is leave the leaves. Just pile them high around your trees. Or if you don't want to do that, stack them in the corner of your yard and let them rot. Rotting leaves are just phenomenal, and it's another free resource. The third heavyweight is compost. There are many ways you can make compost. I am somebody who's limited on time, so I do it the laziest way possible, which is that every bit of green waste from my yard and kitchen scrap from my table goes into a corner in the backyard. I have a brush pile back there. I got a log pile. And I will revisit it in a year, and I find that the beautiful compost is just spilling out of the side of my pallets. It's a little pallet setup. And then I take that and I either just sprinkle it around choice plants, or I'll actually put it in a liquid solution so I can pour it around a plant. And that's called a compost tea. Mm-hmm. Those are my 3 recommended strategies, and they're very straightforward and free. It's just sort of a win-win. I think you've maybe seen this, or another of my inflammatory statements is that I am hard pressed to find any circumstance in the suburban landscape where a fertilizer is necessary. And by fertilizer, I mean something you'd buy at a store or something you'd buy from a tree care or lawn care company. I think compost, wood chips, and leave the leaves are really all you need to build that life, and your plants are going to be happy and they're going to love it.
I agree, Basil, and I'm so glad to be talking to another lazy composter. I do the same. You just set it and forget it. And, turning the pile, chopping it smaller, those things accelerate it, make it quicker. But, who has time for that?
Right. I don't measure my carbon, nitrogen. I don't check the temperature. So many of these things can be very simple. And one of the things I've been wanting, there's almost a need to overcomplicate it to make it official. I don't know. I've not really thought that one out carefully, but many of these things we're discussing are really they're just simple.
And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the compost tea that you brought up. So there's a little controversy about compost teas. Some people are saying there's no proven efficacy, that it doesn't do anything. And then others are saying, well, you're using the wrong compost tea. You're using an inert material at that point.
Yeah, this is a great one. Unfortunately, this is one of those places where companies trying to make a quick buck have sort of ruined it for everybody else. The truth of the matter is that I think the reason, I'm speculating here, but I think the reason compost tea has gotten a bad rap is because you can't buy it. Mm-hmm. It's impossible. The whole idea of compost tea is that you put the life that is in your compost goes in a liquid solution. purely to make it easier to use, but it can only stay in that solution for no more than usually about 8 hours, maybe a little more. So you can't bottle it and you can't ship it. If you're going to use compost tea, it has to be made and used that same day. So there's been a flood of these compost tea products on the market, and you go and test them, and the testers are like, there's nothing in here. And they're right, because the life all died. In some extreme cases, it actually is harmful, because when the tea goes anaerobic, it can actually become it's counterproductive. So the key with compost tea is you just have to make it and use it right that same day. If you have compost, there's life in there, and it can live in solution for a day or less.
So the easiest way I find is just, a couple of handfuls of compost in a bucket of water, let it soak overnight, and then use that for watering.
Exactly. Yep. And if you want to put it through a sprayer, then you actually put the handful of compost into a big old tea bag. You can buy these online and soak it. And then you can pull out the particulate, so it's not going to clog up your sprayer. And that's for people who want to maybe like spray it on their shrubs or apply it differently. You don't have to do it that way, but that's just a way you can make it sprayer compatible.
What are the benefits of spraying it on the foliage itself?
So there is some research that indicates it helps. There's a fungal community that also, bacterial as well, that also live on the canopy of trees and canopy of shrubs. More is being discovered about this, but it's very similar to the communities we find underground. They're just different species. So this does help bolster that community. This is just, we're getting a little fancy now. It doesn't really matter this way. Ultimately, as long as you get compost in the ground, we're building soil. But if you wanted to go the extra distance and you had the time to do so, it's a great way to give a little bit of a nutrient boost directly through your leaves.
And I would think that spraying the foliage, on a hot day could actually cool off the plants a little bit, or also cut down on some of the predator insects that are maybe chewing on the leaves that you don't want to chew on it. Say you have a rose garden.
It could. I always worry a little bit about phytotoxicity. Yes, definitely. And just depends. If we have a record-setting day like we've had this, I'm sure y'all have had many records, as have we. I would be careful. I think morning might be a safer approach.
Yeah, not on a super, super hot day.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we also hear about when you're spraying foliage and that type of thing, it makes me think about the mosquito spray services. So I'm gathering, I'm going to guess you are also not a fan of those.
Yeah, there's so many platforms you can stand on, but the most obvious one is it just doesn't work. It's impossible. If you could make a spray work, which ignores the fact that there's so many little nooks and crannies that mosquitoes can repopulate, you'd have to spray not just your yard, but your neighbor's yards. And then where does that end? Do you spray your whole neighborhood? You send planes over the city just to dump chemicals? It simply does not work. It's just a waste of money. So forgetting the environmental impacts and all the rest of it, just save your money. Sort of another layer to this is that mosquitoes come back quickly. Now that you've sprayed and you've killed everything on the yard, they don't have any predators in place. So we often see a resurgence where the resurgence is actually worse than it was before. We also, this is interesting from a tree standpoint, we can walk onto a property and say, I can tell you right away if they're using a mosquito spray service, because their shrubs are going to be infested with leaf, you name it. The trees are going to have scale insects. There's a proliferation of your scale pests and your aphid pests, because again, all the natural predators were killed in the spray. They take a long time to repopulate, but aphids and scale insects can come back quickly. So we see an explosion of other pests as well. And then let's not forget, these are neurotoxins. I do not want my kids around neurotoxins. I imagine the same is true for other people. Ditto for dogs and cats. These are dangerous products. And people will come and say, these services will knock on your door and say, oh, we use an all-natural product. True. But guess what? Asbestos is all-natural too. Just because it's all-natural doesn't mean it's safe. It's still under...
Certainly. And in your book, you talk a little bit about pocket forests, and you alluded to that being part of your own home garden. So let's talk about the definition of a pocket forest. I'm imagining this little tiny wedge island with 3 trees on it. But
Yeah.
I think we're talking maybe a little bit tiny larger than that. And we're talking about a lot of suburban lots that are, say, a quarter acre,
Yeah.
third of an acre. What type of forest could I grow on that size?
Well, there's one interesting little bit to this. There's no good word in the English language for just a tiny little bit of trees. We've got forest, which is big, woods, still too big. Technically, the term copse, C-O-P-S-E, would describe, but that's just not going to work for like a common name. So we're trying to push, and I know other organizations are as well, this generic term of, we need some generic term for what's like a little tiny forest in suburbia, and we call them pocket forests. It's a good term, I think. And the idea is it's a little place in suburbia. It could be a parking lot island or a small front yard, or in my case, a corner of the backyard, well, about a fourth of my backyard, actually. Just a little, 2,000, 4,000, 6,000 square foot area. And it's the exact same approach I described earlier with the thickets, except for now we're planting native tree species. All the benefits are the same. I won't recap all of that, but it's exactly the same pitch as I made earlier.
And so we probably want to go for a mix of trees, not a monoculture.
Right, yeah. For our pocket forests, we're using generally about 40 native species, but we have the luxury of being able to get lots of native saplings. That's not necessarily the case for many people. I think even if you can get 10 or 20 different species, that's fantastic. And again, I would encourage folks to use the small stuff. If you're planting large trees, this is not going to work. This would be a terrible endeavor. Actually, it'd be very, very hard to do. It's got to be small plant material. The beauty, again, is that within several years, that canopy will close and make it very hard for other species to take hold. It becomes a very low maintenance area. You will still need to do some pruning on the outside of it. But that's true for any tree. You're going to have to do some pruning. The things you don't have to do is you don't have to replenish. You don't have to pull weeds. You don't have to spray an herbicide if you do that to control weeds. There's nothing else that happens in that space. Whereas if you're going with the traditional approach of maybe 1 or 2 trees for that given area, there's a lot of maintenance you have to do around that tree, or else a little forest will grow, a pocket forest. They kind of actually happen naturally if you let it. Of course, we have the invasive species to worry about.
And same thing with the thickets and the pocket forest. I was thinking that there's going to be not every sapling living, correct?
Exactly.
There's going to be some failure.
Lots. We have lots of sites here in this area. We see between a 5 and a 30% mortality, just depending. 5% is actually pretty standard, but we have at least a couple of sites that are in some of the most harsh conditions you can imagine, western facing sun, or just fresh construction, soil that even smells bad. It's rough when it smells bad. Really atrocious. We'll see 30% mortality in sites like that, but even a 30% mortality, no problem. You still have many plants. And this one site I'm thinking of where we did have 30% mortality, if you were to go visit it now, you could have never imagined that 30% of the trees died, because it is exploding with life.
And I think that definitely falls under my laissez-faire, survival of the fittest.
Yes.
Gardening philosophy. If you live, you live. If you didn't, you weren't meant to.
Exactly. We share the same mindset.
That is not the one that I'm going to baby. I'll just say that.
I don't have time to baby it. I love enjoying them, but I cannot get out there and do the babying that I used to be able to do when I was younger and didn't have the obligations that I have now.
Let's talk a little bit about our established trees. If you buy a home or move into a suburban or urban spot and you do have the fortune of having a few oak trees, maybe over 50 years old, and they're starting to decline, or other mature trees, what's my next step when I notice that maybe this tree isn't in the best of health?
Well, I devoted a whole chapter in the book to this discussion because I have now had, I think it's reasonable to say, tens of thousands of appointments in my career. And I have found that we were a removal company years ago. So somebody wants to remove a tree, fine. But over time, as I came to appreciate the beauty of trees and the importance that they play in creating a healthy planet, we transitioned out of tree removals, which was really huge because I was able to sort of let go of the need to, make a buck off of telling you that your tree need to be removed. Now I can be true to what I believe in now, which is I want trees to help heal the planet. So I can look with clear eyes and I can say now, and I've consulted with my colleagues, but we think about 9 times out of 10, trees that people think need to be removed do not actually need to be removed. It's just most of the reasons people think a tree needs to be removed are just either urban legend or just not consistent with how trees grow. And I've hit those topics in this chapter. Unfortunately, because many tree services, even the tree care companies, even the really big national ones, the majority of their work does come from tree removal. So when you call many companies, the rep is faced with this challenging decision of, okay, do I take the easy sale here, $3,000 to remove that tree, or do I try to convince them that the tree's fine, lose the big sale, but maybe instead, sell some compost? Like it's kind of stacked. So I think, unfortunately, many homeowners are at a disadvantage when it comes to trying to save old trees. This is a place where you can save lots of money, and it's a place where you can do mega good. Keeping a mature oak versus removing it, that is a big deal for your local ecosystem. And the things I tell folks with these trees is you focus on soil health, which we've covered. You focus on structure. So we don't want big limbs growing over our houses. We don't want trees splitting on our houses. So we may need to do some pruning to reduce that weight. Also covered in the book. I teach homeowners all about how to do that or how to find somebody who can do that. And then the other thing is we need to keep an eye out for changes, and we need to avoid being the culprit of those changes. So for example, maybe I'm like, oh, I want to add an addition to my house. Well, before you go digging around that old tree, make sure you've got a plan on how not to destroy its root system, because now you might have created a hazard.
Yeah.
So the core tenets are soil and structure. If you get those things right and you don't cause damage, your tree can go on a very long time. We know that oaks in the wild don't even reach the beginning of maturity until 300 years old. And they enter into their mature phase at about 600 years old. Pine trees, we have loblolly pines. They grow to 300 to 500 years old if left undisturbed. They have a lot more life than usually happens in the suburban landscape.
Mm-hmm. I think there's usually, probably you're seeing, Basil, is a tree limb falls, and then there's the panic about the entire tree,
right,
that it needs to go, because it might have hit a car or done a little bit of damage on a fence line, and
right,
then now they're afraid that that's just, if that's coming down, the whole tree is about to fall.
Right. And it's important to remember that trees drop limbs. It's part of being a tree. As they grow up taller, they shed the lower branches and the interior branches that are not able to produce sufficient energy because they have new branches out on the ends that make more energy. So dead limbs is a normal thing. They just have to be pruned out every once in a while if it's near your house. If it's not near your house and it's in the woods, leave it for the birds. Houses have roofs with pockets of light. So the trees do tend to grow over roofs looking for that light. And you can correct that with what's called structural pruning. And the other thing is, if it's a big major storm, well, yeah, sometimes live branches do snap out, but usually those live branches are leafy and fluffy when they're live, and they don't usually cause a lot of damage. It just depends. It's not always true. I actually hit 5 of the things we hear most often. Like, for example, people are always worried about the big trees near the house.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I always like to remind people the big trees actually survived the worst storms that we saw over the last 50 or 75 years. That's actually your strongest tree on the property, so long as you haven't maybe graded out the root system, for example. But assuming nothing's been disturbed, that tree is probably your safest tree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say what's underneath that tree, arborist wood chips, a good ground cover, something to protect that root and trunk area. And, not paving over it. Let's just say that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have to add the one caveat, although your listeners probably know this, but no mulch on the base of the trunk. We want to see that trunk taper out. It's called the trunk flare. Very important.
Yeah. You don't want to just surround it by what we call the volcano mulching that we see. So it should be a donut. It should be like a depression and then go out. Great advice, Basil. How can our listeners contact you for more information, and how can they get a copy of your book?
Well, we're giving the book away for free. It's meant to be a resource that people can use. The ebook is completely free. It's available on our website, leaflimcom. The actual URL is leaflimcom.com/wonder, but if you just go to the site, you'll see it. And then for those who prefer a hard copy, which I love hard copies because it enables me to actually take it out into the yard with me. We did a hard copy version where we used really high quality binding and paper so it can be used out in the yard. And we charge just simply the cost of printing and shipping. And that's also on the website.
Great. And any final thoughts on suburban tree care or advice for our listeners?
I suppose the final advice would just be to have fun and remember that this sort of work in your yard, we can't really impact policy at a national level or a state level, and even sometimes at a local level. It's frustrating. But one thing we can do, we have control over the spaces where we live and we work and we play, and we can make serious, positive change there that actually does good for others and for the well-being of the planet. And I find that to be empowering and meaningful. And I hope that this book is a resource for people to be able to do that. Or if you're already doing it, and many of your listeners are, then fantastic. Let other people know your tips and tricks, and who knows, maybe we'll see widespread change in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Basil.
Brugmansia plant profile. Angel's trumpet, Brugmansia species, is a perennial plant from South America with large trumpet-shaped flowers that hang facing down. They bloom in mid to late summer and are pleasantly fragrant, especially in the early evening. The plant is moth-pollinated. It is also attractive to hummingbirds. It is hardy to USDA zones 8 to 10. In our region, where it is not winter hardy, Brugmansia is typically grown in a large container and then taken in when the weather turns cold. The container can be sunken into the ground during the growing season, if desired. Brugmansia grows best in full sun. Pot it up in well-draining soils and water it regularly. Apply an all-purpose fertilizer to encourage continual blooming. It can reach heights up to 20 feet tall. If it gets too big for your space, prune it back in early spring before the new season's growth emerges. The plant is a vigorous grower and doesn't mind a hard cutback. To propagate Brugmansia, take a 6-inch cutting in early spring and put it in water. Once roots form, pot it up in a 1-gallon container. Brugmansia is in the nightshade family, so it is deer resistant, but should be kept away from small children and pets. Brugmansia, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, I spent a few days at the beach towns in Delaware and across in Cape May, New Jersey. You can check out my photos from some of the gardens that I visited there on our Instagram feed at WDC Gardener. And I came home to a pleasant surprise in my garden, which is those surprise lilies, aka naked ladies, also known as lycoris. And they are so beautiful. I love the shimmeriness to the petals. I love their light scent, and they make such a great cut flower as well. Over at the community garden, I was pleasantly surprised as well to find that the gherkins have formed, and I was able to cut a few from the vine and snack on those for lunch yesterday, and they were delicious. And that was just exactly 1 month after we planted the seeds in the ground. So that summer heat was good for something. In our garden tips last week, we shared lots of tips about squash and melon growing, including the tip to wrap your foil snugly, and that would be aluminum foil, around the stems of squash plants right at the base where they're emerging from the ground to prevent the squash vine borer. And we have other tips about squash growing and many other topics. If you follow us at WDC Gardener on Twitter, on our Facebook page, Washington Gardener Magazine, or join our Google group, Washington Gardener, and that's free and available and open to anybody to join. Some upcoming local gardening events in the DC area that you might be interested in include the Montgomery County Fair in Montgomery County, Maryland, and that takes place at the fairgrounds in Gaithersburg. This year it is the 75th annual fair, so a pretty big deal. And I always enjoy entering some cut flowers and some vegetables into that. We'll see with this year's drought how much I'm able to enter. But even if I only do a few entries, I always make a point of going over to visit the Montgomery County Master Gardeners demonstration garden. They always have lots of great things to see in that, and some Master Gardeners on hand for you to talk to about any of your garden questions. In other events, the Maryland Native Plant Society is hosting their monthly program on Maryland trees under attack, what we can do, and that is with speaker Faith Campbell on August 27th at 7 p.m. online. You can register for that for free at mdflora.org. And finally, don't forget to claim your GardenDC embroidered patches. If you have been a past supporter or current supporter of the GardenDC podcast, you can do so for as little as 99 cents a month at podcasters.spotify.com. And you can find the support link also in our show notes. Once you filled out the support form, send me an email to kathyjentz at gmail.com with your mailing address, and I'll send that patch right off to you. Happy gardening!
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Groundcover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of their lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf, and which plants are the best ones for the job. Groundcover Revolution is here with you all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Groundcover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Groundcover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and bookshop.org. In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Teri Speight, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
This is Christy Page with Green Prints, with the last word on Hollyhock Memories Dancing with the Ladies, a story by Ellen Sampson. Like most enthusiastic gardeners, I cherish every aspect of my garden, from selecting and planting each green friend with care to watching them flourish. Gardening is my sanctuary. Among all my beloved plants, the old-fashioned hollyhocks hold a special place in my heart. In the days before video games and computers, when outdoor play reigned supreme, my sisters and I found joy in the simplest of pleasures. Introduced by Grandma one summer, the hollyhocks became our cherished playmates, fondly known as the Dancing Ladies. Whenever water flowed down the neighborhood gutters, we eagerly gathered 3 of the largest hollyhock blooms from the garden. With skirts twirling, we'd set our floral companions afloat, racing them down the block as if they were elegant dancers in a grand ballroom. The goal? To reach the end of the block before our floral friends did, plucking them from the water's grasp before they disappeared into the drain. Though the days of sidewalk dances are long gone, the memories linger, blossoming anew each year with the return of the hollyhocks. As I watch them bloom, I can't help but smile, reminiscing about the joy of sisterhood and the magic of dancing with the ladies. This has been Christy Page with greenprints.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com or washingtongardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.